7.4, which is factoring trinomials with a leading coefficient other than 1. And let me make a recommendation before we jump into this. You should master 7.3, meaning not just watch the video, but do all the practice problems and make sure you've got it down before you try to do this one. It's going to be too hard to hold it all in your brain at once. So I highly, highly recommend that you work one section at a time and you master the previous one before moving on. But if you watched my previous video, if you did the homework that goes with it, you should be ready to do 7.4, which is factoring trinomials with a leading coefficient other than 1. Now the good news is this section is exactly the same as the previous section. The only problem is the shortcuts don't apply. So we're going to do it the exact same way, but without any of the shortcuts. So you may remember, but I'm going to write the steps again. Step 1 is going to be multiply the first coefficient times the last. Multiply the first coefficient times the last. In this particular example, the first coefficient is 10 and the last coefficient is 12. So when I multiply them, I'm going to end up with 10 times 12, that's 120. So done, that's step 1. Step 2, also going to be exactly the same. You're going to find two numbers, and the two numbers must multiply to be the result of step 1. So they've got to multiply to be 100. I'm going to go ahead and write the result of step 1, but I'm just talking about 120. They multiply to be 120. And they have to do one other thing. They add to be the middle coefficient. And the middle coefficient in this example, let me move this over so I got some room to write it. The middle coefficient is -23. So we're going to find two numbers, and I always write it like this. Blank times blank equals 120. They multiply to be 120. And they have to add to be -23. Now the best way to do this is just to make a list of stuff that multiplies to be 120. So you might start with like 12 and 10. And there's always negative versions, so it could also be -12 and -10. I usually like to start with the positives and then you can make the matching negative list. But let's see, 12 and 10. Those will not add to be 23, so that's not going to work. And then I might think, well, let's see. What about 15 and 8? And actually, right away, if you check that, 15 plus 8 is 23, so it's close. So the negative version, -15 and -8, I think is going to do the trick. And to figure that out, I'm gonna plug it in here just to make absolutely certain. -15, -8, -15, -8, and let's check it. Well, -15 times -8 is in fact 120. And -15 plus -8 is in fact -23, so it works. We did it. That's the answer to step 2. So now we move on to step 3. Step 3 is you split up the middle term. Split up the middle term. So I'm going to copy, like literally copy and paste what I had before. But I'm going to make one small adjustment. I've still got, everything is exactly the same, except this -23 is going to get split into two pieces. So 10z squared stays, plus 12 stays. But instead of -23, well, instead of -23z, I'm going to use these two numbers that I just found. So I'm going to write -15z and then plus -8z. You could also just have written -8z. It doesn't really matter at this step. But I just split up the middle term. negative 23 splits into negative 15 and 8. And we know that because we figured that out in the previous step. Negative 23 splits nicely into negative 15 and negative 8. From here, we just have one more step. Step 4 is factor by grouping. Factor by grouping. So I'm going to take this expression that I just made, and I made it by splitting up that middle term, and then I'm going to group. So I group these first two together, and I group these second two together. And remember, this parentheses goes outside of the negative because you can never separate a number from its negative. So it would be inappropriate to put a parentheses here. That would be bad. So that's why it's nice that I've got plus a negative. Plus a negative is perfect. If it just said minus, I recommend writing it as plus a negative and then sticking your parentheses right there. Anyway, from here, all we got to do is take out what each one has in common. So this first set of parentheses, well, they both divide by 5. And they also both have a z. So I'm going to take out 5z and then write down what's left. Well, 10 divided by 5, I'm left with 2. And then if I had z squared and I divided it by z, or I took out a z, I'm left with 1z. Then I do the same thing with negative 15. Negative 15 divided by 5 is going to be negative 3. If I take out a z, there's no z left, so I'm done. If you want to check it, you could always distribute this back, and you should end up here. If you don't, you made a mistake. Now I'm going to move on to the second parentheses, and you may remember, if the first one is negative, we take out a negative. And then when I think about it for a little bit, I realize that they both divide by 4, so they have a 4 in common. So I'm going to take out a 4, and then I'm going to write down what's left. Well, negative 8 divided by negative 4 is going to be 2, and the z stays. Then I've got 12, and 12 divided by negative 4 is going to be negative 3. I am almost finished. Now I've got one big first term and a big second term. And you may notice, but they both have 2z minus 3. So I'm going to take it out. And then I'm going to write down what's left. What's left is going to be 5z and then negative 4. And this is my final answer. I have done it. Okay, so that is factoring trinomials with the leading coefficient other than 1. And let me give you this recommendation one last time. Please make sure that you have mastered, you've practiced, not just watched the videos, but you've practiced and you've implemented all previous sections before you try to do this one. Because you may notice, but we used the skills from every single previous section. We used greatest common factor, we used factor by grouping, we used the steps from factoring trinomials with leading coefficient of 1. So it all builds off of each other. So you need to learn the first sections before you try and come finish this one.